Fahad, oblivious, greeted him warmly. As Zayan's gaze lingered on her a moment too long, she felt both intrigued and alarmed. "I couldn't help but notice you," Zayan said, his tone smooth, yet unsettling. Amira glanced at Fahad, hoping he wouldn't notice the blush creeping up her cheeks. He watched Amira step into the boutique hotel. His stomach churned when Zayan appeared moments later, greeting her with a smile that ignited every ounce of anger in Fahad's body. His grip on the steering wheel tightened as the elevator doors closed behind them. What is she doing with him? He had two choices: confront them now or gather the truth piece by piece. "You don't have to live this life anymore," Zayan whispered, his hand brushing against Amira's. "There's a way out for both of us." Amira's pulse quickened. What was he suggesting? Fahad's voice echoed through the vault, cutting through the tense silence. "What the hell is going on here?" Amira froze as she overheard Zayan and the manager's heated exchange. "She knows too much," the manager hissed. "She's a liability." Welcome to the Alibis Exposed, where trust meets betrayal in the dark. Amira stood at the kitchen sink, her hands submerged in soapy water, gazing out at the small garden behind their modest home. Her thoughts drifted to Fahad, who would be returning from work soon. They had been married for 8 years, and while life wasn't perfect, she believed their bond was strong enough to endure anything. Fahad was a banker, working tirelessly to ensure they had a roof over their heads and food on the table. Amira admired his dedication, but often wished he would spend more time at home. She understood his sacrifices, but missed the simplicity of their early days, when love, not responsibilities, dictated their lives. That evening, Fahad surprised her with a dinner plan. "You deserve a break," he said with a smile, his tired eyes lighting up briefly. They dined at an upscale restaurant, a rare treat in their otherwise frugal lifestyle. As they shared laughs and memories over dessert, Amira's gaze wandered. Across the room, a man caught her attention. Zayan exuded an effortless charm. He was seated alone, his sharp features and confident demeanor impossible to ignore. When their eyes met, Amira quickly looked away, feeling a strange flutter in her chest. Fahad, oblivious to her momentary distraction, continued talking about his plans for the weekend. As fate would have it, Zayan approached their table. He introduced himself as a friend of the restaurant's owner. Fahad, ever polite, invited him to join them. Their conversation was cordial, but Amira found herself drawn to Zayan's wit and charisma. She noticed the ease with which he spoke, contrasting Fahad's more reserved nature. After dinner, Zayan bid them farewell with a smile that lingered in Amira's mind long after he left. As they drove home, Fahad spoke about the evening, but Amira's thoughts were elsewhere. She chastised herself for her wandering mind, convincing herself it was nothing more than a fleeting moment. The next few weeks passed uneventfully, or so it seemed. Fahad's work hours grew longer, leaving Amira with more time alone. It was during one of these lonely afternoons that she bumped into Zayan at a local park. Their conversation started casually, but soon grew personal. Zayan's interest in her life felt intoxicating, a stark contrast to Fahad's predictable routine. One meeting led to another. Amira told herself it was harmless, just two people finding solace in conversation. But the lines blurred, and soon she found herself sneaking out to meet Zayan, feeling alive in a way she hadn't in years. Unbeknownst to Amira, Zayan had done his research. He knew about Fahad's position at the bank and saw an opportunity. What started as a chance encounter evolved into a calculated move. Zayan's charm was not just for Amira, it was his way into her life and ultimately her husband's bank. Amira's days grew more complicated. At home, she continued to play the role of a devoted wife. With Fahad, her guilt began to surface in subtle ways: missed glances, distracted conversations, and moments of hesitation. Fahad, preoccupied with work, failed to notice the changes, assuming her silence was a result of their busy lives. Zayan, on the other hand, fueled her emotions. He made her feel seen, appreciated, and desirable. Amira found herself drawn deeper into his world, unaware of the trap being set. Zayan's calculated moves were seamless, each interaction pulling her further from Fahad and closer to him. He began planting ideas about how unfair her life was, subtly questioning the love and attention she received from her husband. The breaking point came one evening when Zayan invited her to his apartment. The setting was intimate, the conversation charged with emotions. Amira crossed a line she never thought she would. Her heart raced with a mix of excitement and guilt, her mind torn between the life she had built with Fahad and the thrill Zayan offered. That night, as Fahad worked late, at the bank, Amira sat alone in their living room. Her phone buzzed with a message from Zayan. "Thinking of you." She stared at the screen, her emotions in turmoil. For the first time, she felt the weight of her choices, the consequences looming on the horizon. Yet, a part of her couldn't stop, captivated by the illusion Zayan had created. Fahad, on the other hand, was oblivious to the storm brewing. He had always trusted Amira implicitly, never doubting her loyalty. His days were filled with meetings and numbers, his nights consumed by the stress of running the bank. Even when he noticed her becoming distant, he attributed it to their busy lives, promising himself he'd make it up to her soon. Amira's secret life continued to grow. Her meetings with Zayan became more frequent, each one deepening her feelings for him. She knew it was wrong, but found herself unable to let go. The thrill of being with Zayan was intoxicating, a stark contrast to the mundane reality of her life with Fahad. One evening, as Fahad returned home late, he found Amira sitting on the couch, lost in thought. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his voice tinged with concern. Amira forced a smile, dismissing his worries with a vague excuse about being tired. Fahad nodded, his exhaustion overriding his intuition. Meanwhile, Zayan was playing his cards carefully. He knew he had Amira hooked, but needed more. He began subtly probing her about Fahad's work, showing interest in the bank. Amira, blinded by her feelings, shared more than she should have, unknowingly giving Zayan the information he needed to put his plan into motion. The cracks in Amira and Fahad's marriage grew wider. Fahad, though unaware of Zayan's existence, felt the distance between them. He tried to bridge the gap, planning a weekend getaway to rekindle their bond. Amira agreed, guilt gnawing at her as she accepted his efforts while still seeing Zayan in secret. The weekend getaway was a bittersweet experience. Fahad's genuine attempts to reconnect reminded Amira of the man she had fallen in love with. For a brief moment, she considered ending things with Zayan and rebuilding her life with Fahad. But Zayan's hold on her was too strong, his promises of a different life too alluring. Returning from the trip, Amira found herself at a crossroads. She knew she couldn't continue living a double life, but the thought of losing Zayan was unbearable. Little did she know her decisions would soon set off a chain of events that would change all their lives forever. The days following their weekend getaway were filled with a strange mix of emotions for Amira. She tried to convince herself that she could find a way to keep both her worlds intact, but the growing guilt began to eat away at her. Fahad, now more attentive than before, seemed oblivious to the emotional storm raging inside her. He planned small surprises, bringing home flowers, cooking dinner together, and even taking an interest in her hobbies. These gestures reminded Amira of the man she had once deeply loved, complicating her feelings further. Zayan, however, was relentless in his pursuit. He texted her constantly, showering her with compliments and reminders of their stolen moments. His charm was intoxicating, and Amira found it difficult to resist. But something about Zayan's sudden interest in Fahad's bank began to make her uneasy. He often asked questions about Fahad's schedule, the bank's operations, and even the security systems. Amira dismissed her concerns, convincing herself it was harmless curiosity. One evening, as Fahad worked late at the bank, Zayan invited Amira to a private dinner at his apartment. The atmosphere was warm, the lighting dim, and the conversation intimate. Zayan confessed how deeply he cared for her, promising her a life filled with excitement and love. "You deserve more than just being someone's second priority," he whispered, his hand brushing against hers. Amira's heart raced. She wanted to believe him, to escape the confines of her predictable life. However, as the night wore on, Zayan's questions about the bank resurfaced. This time, his curiosity felt calculated. "Does Fahad ever talk about the bank's security, like how safe everything is?" he asked casually, pouring her another glass of wine. Amira hesitated, her instincts warning her that something wasn't right. Yet, under Zayan's spell, she found herself sharing minor details, rationalizing that it wasn't a big deal. Meanwhile, Fahad's life at the bank was growing increasingly stressful. The financial strain of managing a small institution in a competitive market was taking its toll. His trusted manager, Abbas, had recently expressed frustration about being overlooked for promotions. Fahad tried to reassure him, promising better opportunities in the future. But Abbas's resentment simmered beneath the surface, unnoticed by Fahad. Unbeknownst to both Fahad and Amira, Abbas had crossed paths with Zayan. It was not a mere coincidence. Zayan had sought him out deliberately, knowing he could exploit Abbas's dissatisfaction. Over drinks, Zayan painted a picture of a partnership that could benefit them both. "Think about it," he said, leaning in. "You've worked there for years, and what do you have to show for it? Together, we could make things right." Abbas, desperate and disillusioned, reluctantly agreed to hear him out. As Zayan's plan began to take shape, he tightened his grip on Amira. He made her feel indispensable, feeding her dreams of a better life while subtly manipulating her emotions. Amira, torn between her loyalty to Fahad and her feelings for Zayan, began to withdraw from her husband even further. One evening, Fahad came home earlier than expected and found Amira sitting on the edge of their bed, staring blankly at her phone. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine concern. Amira nodded, forcing a smile. "Just tired," she replied, slipping her phone into her pocket. Fahad didn't press further, but the growing distance between them was becoming harder to ignore. The turning point came when Zayan proposed a weekend trip. "Just us," he said, his eyes full of promise. Amira hesitated, knowing it would be nearly impossible to explain her absence to Fahad. But Zayan's persistence won, and she found herself concocting a lie about visiting an old friend. Fahad, though surprised, encouraged her to take a break, unaware of the betrayal unfolding before him. The trip was everything Zayn had promised, luxurious and thrilling. Amira felt alive in his presence, her guilt temporarily overshadowed by the intoxicating escape. But during a quiet moment, Zayn brought up Fahad again. "Do you think he'd ever notice if something went missing at the bank?" he asked, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. Amira frowned, her unease growing. "Why do you keep asking about the bank?" she questioned, her voice tinged with suspicion. Zayan's expression softened as he reached for her hand. "I just want to understand your world," he said, his voice gentle. "I want to know everything about you." Amira's doubts melted under his gaze, but a small voice in the back of her mind refused to be silenced. Back home, Fahad began to sense something was amiss. Amira's absences, her distracted demeanor, and her guarded behavior didn't escape his notice. He confided in Abbas, who feigned concern while secretly feeding Fahad's insecurities. "Maybe she's just feeling neglected," Abbas suggested, planting seeds of doubt. Fahad resolved to confront Amira, determined to salvage their relationship. Amira, meanwhile, was grappling with her own demons. The thrill of her affair with Zayn was fading, replaced by a gnawing sense of unease. She began to question his intentions, recalling his pointed interest in the bank. Her heart ached as she thought of Fahad, who had done nothing to deserve her betrayal. For the first time, she considered ending things with Zayn, but the fear of losing the excitement he brought into her life held her back. The stage was set for a confrontation. Fahad, driven by suspicion, decided to follow Amira one afternoon. What he discovered would shatter his world and set off a chain of events that none of them could have foreseen. Fahad's decision to follow Amira wasn't made lightly. For days he had wrestled with his suspicions, blaming himself for the growing distance between them. But as her absences grew more frequent and her explanations more vague, he could no longer ignore the nagging feeling that something was wrong. It was a crisp Thursday afternoon when Fahad left the bank earlier than usual. He had deliberately avoided telling Amira about his change in schedule, hoping to catch a glimpse of her routine. Parking his car a few blocks away from their house, he waited. It wasn't long before he saw her emerge, dressed impeccably and carrying a small handbag. She walked with a purpose that Fahad hadn't seen in months, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Keeping a safe distance, Fahad followed her to a cafe in the upscale part of town. His heart pounded as he watched her take a seat near the window. Minutes later, a man joined her. Fahad's stomach turned as he recognized Zayn from their brief encounter at the restaurant weeks ago. The two of them appeared engrossed in conversation, their expressions animated. Fahad's chest tightened as he watched Amira laugh at something. Zayn said, her hand lightly touching his arm. Unable to bear the sight any longer, Fahad turned away, his mind racing. He wanted to storm in and confront them, but knew it would only create a scene. Instead, he left, his thoughts a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and confusion. Back at home, he sat in silence, replaying the scene in his head. The woman he had trusted, implicitly, the woman he had loved unconditionally, was hiding something from him. Amira returned home later that evening, her demeanor unchanged. She greeted Fahad with the same forced smile she had perfected over the past few weeks. He studied her closely, searching for any sign of guilt or remorse, but her mask was flawless. Fahad decided not to confront her just yet. Instead, he resolved to gather more information, his hurt now fueling a quiet determination. Over the next few days, Fahad's observations became sharper. He noticed how Amira's phone was always within reach, how she frequently checked her messages, and how her mood seemed to brighten after each notification. He also began piecing together her schedule, noting the times she claimed to be running errands or meeting friends. Meanwhile, Zayan's plan was gaining momentum. With Abbas as his reluctant accomplice, he had begun laying the groundwork for a scheme that would target Fahad's bank. Abbas, driven by resentment, provided insider information about the bank's operations, including its vulnerabilities. Zayan's charm and promises of a lucrative payoff kept Abbas on board, though a part of him felt uneasy about betraying his long-time employer. Amira, caught in the middle, remained oblivious to the extent of Zayan's manipulations. Her encounters with him had become more frequent, each meeting pulling her further into his orbit. She found herself confiding in him about her frustrations with Fahad, unknowingly giving him ammunition to deepen the wedge between her and her husband. One evening, as Fahad worked late, Amira sat on the couch scrolling through her phone. A message from Zayan lit up the screen. "Tomorrow at 4 p.m., same place." She hesitated before replying, a pang of guilt gnawing at her. But the thought of seeing him, of escaping the monotony of her life, proved too tempting. The next day, Fahad decided to follow her again. This time, he was prepared. Borrowing a friend's car to remain inconspicuous, he trailed her to a different location, a boutique hotel on the outskirts of town. His heart sank as he watched her enter the lobby, greeted warmly by Zayan. They disappeared into the elevator, leaving Fahad to grapple with the devastating confirmation of his worst fears. For hours, Fahad sat in his car, unable to move. The betrayal cut deeper than he thought possible, each minute amplifying his pain. When Amira finally returned home that evening, Fahad's demeanor was cold but controlled. He refrained from confronting her, knowing it wasn't the right time. Instead, he began devising a plan of his own. Back at the bank, Fahad's interactions with Abbas grew more strained. He couldn't shake the feeling that Abbas was hiding something, his recent behavior uncharacteristically guarded. Fahad began reviewing internal records, searching for irregularities that might explain the tension. What he found left him stunned. Several transactions bore subtle discrepancies, all traceable to Abbas. Though the amounts were small, their frequency suggested something larger at play. Fahad decided to keep his findings to himself for the time being. He needed more evidence to confront Abbas, just as he needed more clarity about Amira's involvement with Zayan. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, but the picture they painted was more horrifying than he could have imagined. Amira, meanwhile, was beginning to feel the strain of her double life. Zayan's demands for her time had grown more insistent, and his questions about Fahad and the bank more probing. She found herself questioning his motives, her initial excitement now tempered by unease. Yet, every time she considered pulling away, Zayan would draw her back with his charm and promises. One night, as Fahad lay awake next to her, his mind raced with thoughts of betrayal and revenge. He knew he couldn't let this continue, but he also knew he needed to act carefully. His trust in Amira was shattered, but a part of him still hoped to salvage what remained of their marriage. However, the presence of Zayan, a man who had not only stolen his wife's affection but was also targeting his livelihood, left no room for mercy. The stage was set for a confrontation, one that would bring all the players together in an explosive collision of secrets and lies. Fahad's quiet resolve, Amira's wavering loyalty, Zayan's calculated schemes, and Abbas's growing guilt were all hurtling toward an inevitable reckoning. Zayan stood at the window, of his upscale apartment, watching the city lights shimmer against the dark sky. His lips curled into a sly smile as he replayed the events of the day in his mind. Everything was falling into place. Amira was no longer just a pawn. She had become emotionally invested, and with her attachment came an open door into Fahad's world. Amira, on the other hand, felt torn. Her secret life with Zayan had grown more consuming, yet the guilt she felt toward Fahad weighed heavily on her. She started avoiding direct conversations with her husband, afraid her lies might slip through. Meanwhile, Zayan's influence over her only grew stronger. He knew just how to comfort her, playing the role of a perfect listener, making her feel seen in ways Fahad never had the time for. One evening, Zayan proposed a bold idea. They sat together in his dimly lit living room, the tension between them palpable. "Amira, I've been thinking," he began, his voice smooth yet persuasive. "You deserve more than this life of hiding and half-truths. Why don't we take a step forward? Let's build something real together." Amira's heart raced. "What do you mean? Fahad, he's my husband," she said, her voice shaky. Zayan leaned closer, his eyes locking onto hers. "I know, but ask yourself this. Is he truly your partner? Does he make you feel alive? Or has he just become a habit, a convenience?" His words struck a chord, planting seeds of doubt that Amira struggled to dismiss. Over the next few weeks, Zayan's plan became clearer. He subtly introduced the idea of Fahad's bank, hinting at its potential as an avenue for their future. "You've told me so much about the bank," he said one day, feigning casual curiosity. "It's impressive what Fahad's achieved. Imagine what someone with vision could do with resources like that." Amira's brow furrowed. "What are you saying?" "Nothing, darling," Zayan replied with a disarming smile. "Just dreaming out loud. Forget I said anything." But his words lingered in her mind, and over time, Zayan began to weave a narrative that painted Fahad as a man who had taken advantage of Amira's loyalty, leaving her unfulfilled and trapped. Meanwhile, Fahad was beginning to sense the distance in their marriage. He noticed Amira's distracted demeanor, her late-night outings explained away with vague excuses about meeting friends. One evening, he confronted her. "Amira, is everything okay? You've been different lately," he said, his eyes searching hers for answers. Amira forced a smile, masking her inner turmoil. "I'm fine, Fahad. Just tired, that's all." "Your long hours at the bank have been hard on both of us," she said, subtly deflecting the blame. Fahad nodded, guilt washing over him. "You're right. I've been so focused on work. Maybe we should take some time for ourselves, a vacation or something." Amira's heart sank. She wanted to believe his intentions, but her connection to Zayan had clouded her judgment. "That sounds nice," she replied half-heartedly, knowing she was too entangled in her double life to break free so easily. At the bank, Fahad's trusted manager Arman was beginning to pick up on the tension in his boss's personal life. Arman had always been observant, and while he respected Fahad, he harbored his own frustrations about being overlooked for promotions and recognition. When Zayan approached him under the guise of a potential business investor, Arman's curiosity was piqued. Zayan played his role flawlessly, presenting himself as a savvy entrepreneur interested in collaborating with the bank. Over a series of meetings, he subtly tested Arman's loyalty to Fahad, sowing seeds of doubt about his employer's leadership. "You're clearly the backbone of this bank," Zayan said during one such meeting. "It's a shame Fahad doesn't recognize your value. A man with your skills deserves more." Arman's resentment grew. He began entertaining Zayan's ideas, not realizing the depth of the trap being set. Zayan's charm and persuasive tactics left little room for suspicion, and before long, Arman found himself agreeing to small, seemingly harmless tasks that aligned with Zayan's broader plan. Amira's internal conflict reached a tipping point when Zayan proposed a shocking idea. "Amira, I've been thinking about us," he said one night. "We can't keep living like this, sneaking around. Fahad, he's in the way. What if there was a way to set ourselves free?" Amira's eyes widened. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice trembling. Zayan took her hands in his expression earnest. "I'm saying we deserve a chance to be happy. Fahad's bank is the key. With the right moves, we could secure a future together, but it means making some hard choices." Amira recoiled, the weight of his words sinking in. "I can't do that to him. He's my husband. And yet, here you are with me," Zayan countered. "You've already crossed lines, Amira. What's one more step if it means freedom?" Amira was speechless, torn between her loyalty to Fahad and the intoxicating pull of Zayan's vision. The room felt suffocating as she grappled with the implications of his plan. Deep down, she knew she was in too deep, but extricating herself felt impossible. Fahad, oblivious to the storm brewing around him, continued to pour himself into his work. He planned a surprise for Amira, hoping to reignite the spark in their marriage. On a quiet Friday evening, he returned home with flowers and a reservation at her favorite restaurant. "Amira, get dressed. We're going out tonight," he said, with a hopeful smile. Amira hesitated, her mind racing. Zayan had asked to meet her that evening, but Fahad's earnestness made it difficult to refuse. "Of course," she replied, forcing a smile. At dinner, Fahad spoke about their future, sharing dreams of expanding the bank and traveling together. Amira listened quietly, her guilt mounting with every word. She wanted to tell him the truth, to come clean about everything, but the thought of losing Zayan and the life he promised held her back. Unbeknownst to them, Zayan watched from a distance, his eyes cold and calculating. He had followed them to the restaurant, ensuring his grip on Amira remained firm. The sight of her with Fahad only fueled his determination to execute his plan, one that would soon unravel their lives in ways none of them could foresee. Amira's heart raced as she stepped into Zayan's apartment, her mind clouded with emotions she couldn't quite untangle. The tension between guilt and excitement had become a familiar yet unnerving part of her life. Zayan greeted her with a warm smile and outstretched arms, his effortless charm only intensifying her internal conflict. "You've been quiet lately," Zayan remarked as he handed her a glass of wine. His gaze lingered on her, a mix of curiosity and concern. Amira hesitated before responding. "Fahad, he's been more attentive recently. It's complicated." Zayan's expression shifted subtly, a flicker of frustration masked by understanding. "You deserve someone who sees you completely, Amira, not just when it's convenient." His words hit a nerve, and she looked away, guilt tightening its grip on her. Yet, as Zayan reached for her hand, his touch seemed to melt her doubts, if only for a moment. Fahad, meanwhile, found himself increasingly preoccupied with his work at the bank. The robbery attempt had left a lingering unease, and he'd poured himself into ensuring the institution's security was airtight. He'd also noticed Amira's growing distance, though he chalked it up to her own stress and the pressures of their life together. One afternoon, Fahad called a meeting with the bank's management team to discuss implementing advanced security measures. The manager, Khalid, nodded along but inwardly bristled at Fahad's insistence on scrutinizing every detail. Khalid's role in the failed heist had gone undetected, but Fahad's newfound vigilance made him uneasy. "I want every transaction monitored closely," Fahad instructed, his tone firm. "We can't afford any oversight." Khalid forced a smile, masking his irritation. "Of course, sir. I'll personally oversee the changes." As the meeting concluded, Khalid's mind churned with thoughts of revenge. Fahad's relentless perfectionism had always grated on him, but now, with the robbery's failure, his resentment boiled over. He decided it was time to strike back, aligning himself more closely with Zayan, who'd begun whispering promises of a more lucrative future. Amira's world continued to spiral as her relationship with Zayan deepened. She knew she was treading on dangerous ground, but Zayan's magnetic pull made it impossible for her to extricate herself. He began to confide in her about his plans, subtly planting the seeds of his next move. "You know, Fahad's bank is sitting on untapped wealth," Zayan said one evening as they sat on his balcony. "If managed correctly, that money could change lives." Amira frowned. "What are you saying?" Zayan's smile was disarming. "Nothing drastic. Just imagine what we could do together if we had access to those resources." Amira's stomach churned. She'd never considered herself capable of deceit, yet here she was, entangled in a web of lies and drawn toward a man whose ambitions scared her. Still, a part of her yearned for the excitement Zayan promised, a stark contrast to the predictability of her life with Fahad. The day Khalid and Zayan put their plan into motion began like any other. Fahad kissed Amira goodbye before heading to work, unaware of the storm brewing around him. Amira, too, pretended everything was normal, though her heart pounded with dread. She'd overheard enough of Zayan's conversations with Khalid to piece together their scheme, yet she'd done nothing to stop it. As the hours ticked by, Zayan and Khalid executed their plan with meticulous precision. Khalid used his position to disable key security measures within the bank, while Zayan coordinated the external logistics. Their goal was not only to seize a significant sum of money, but to leave Fahad's reputation in tatters. Amira spent the day in a haze, her mind oscillating between fear and denial. She'd convinced herself that Zayan wouldn't go through with it, that his feelings for her would outweigh his greed. But as evening approached and Fahad still hadn't returned home, her anxiety reached a breaking point. The phone rang, shattering the tense silence. Amira hesitated before answering, her hand trembling as she brought the receiver to her ear. "Amira?" Fahad's voice was strained, laced with an urgency she'd never heard before. "Fahad? What's wrong?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's been an incident at the bank," he said. "I'm fine, but it's bad, Amira. Really bad." Amira's knees buckled and she sank into the nearest chair. "What happened?" "I can't get into the details now," Fahad replied. "Just stay home, lock the doors. I'll explain everything when I get back." At the bank, chaos reigned. Authorities swarmed the building, questioning employees and sifting through evidence. Khalid maintained a facade of innocence, skillfully deflecting suspicion. Fahad, however, was relentless, demanding answers and scrutinizing every detail. His dedication to uncovering the truth only deepened Khalid's determination to see him fall. Back at Zayan's apartment, the atmosphere was tense. Khalid had arrived to debrief, and the two men discussed their next steps. "Fahad's not as clueless as I thought," Khalid admitted. "He's already questioning the security logs." Zayan's jaw tightened. "We can't afford any loose ends. Make sure everything points away from us." Khalid nodded, though doubt flickered in his eyes. And Amira? She knows more than she lets on. Zayan hesitated, his usual confidence faltering. Leave her out of this. I'll handle her. That night, Amira's guilt became unbearable. She replayed Fahad's strained voice in her mind, the weight of her betrayal pressing down on her. When Zayan called, she ignored it, unable to face him. Instead, she sat alone in the darkness, grappling with the consequences of her actions. The sound of Fahad's key turning in the lock jolted her from her thoughts. He entered the house looking exhausted, his tie askew and his eyes heavy with worry. Amira, he said, collapsing onto the couch. It's worse than I thought. Someone sabotaged the bank's systems. We've lost millions. Amira's breath caught in her throat. Do you know who's behind it? Fahad shook his head. Not yet, but I will find out. And when I do, they'll pay. His words sent a chill down her spine. As she watched him, the man she'd once loved so deeply, she realized there was no turning back. Her choices had set them on a path from which none of them could escape. The night of the robbery arrived, shrouded in a thick veil of tension. The bank's grand facade glowed faintly under the streetlights as Fahad, unaware of the betrayal brewing, worked late in his office. Inside the bank, the air was heavy, each tick of the clock amplifying the impending chaos. Amira was at home, her thoughts consumed by the weight of her choices. Zayan had reassured her that everything would go smoothly, but doubt clawed at her heart. She paced the living room, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. The life she had once cherished now seemed like a distant memory, replaced by a web of lies and deceit. At the bank, Zayan and the manager finalized their preparations. The manager, motivated by his resentment toward Fahad, ensured all security measures were disabled, leaving the vault vulnerable. Zayan's charisma had won the manager's trust, but little did he know Zayan had no intention of sharing the spoils. Fahad's routine work was interrupted when he noticed unusual activity on the security cameras. Screens that usually displayed a clear feed now flickered with static. Concerned, he called the manager, who dismissed it as a minor glitch. "It'll be fixed by morning," the manager assured him, his voice steady despite the lie. Meanwhile, Zayan and his accomplices entered the bank through the back entrance. The silence of the night was punctuated by the sound of their footsteps and the faint hum of their equipment. Zayan's mind raced with thoughts of success, but beneath his confidence lay a flicker of fear, a fear of being caught, of everything unraveling. Inside the vault room, Zayan marveled at the wealth before him. Stacks of cash and glimmering valuables lay within reach, symbols of the life he had always desired. As he began filling the bags, a shadow crossed his mind. He thought of Amira, of the promises he had made. Despite his selfish motives, he couldn't deny the connection he felt with her. Unbeknownst to Zayan, Fahad had grown increasingly suspicious. He decided to investigate the security breach himself, leaving his office and heading toward the vault. The closer he got, the more evident it became that something was amiss. The usually pristine hallway was littered with footprints and faint traces of dirt. As Fahad approached the vault, he heard muffled voices. His heart raced, a mix of fear and anger surging through him. He peered through the partially open door and froze at the sight of Zayan and his team. Betrayal hit him like a blow to the chest, the realization sinking in as he recognized Zayan from the dinner. Fahad's shock turned to fury. He stepped into the room, his voice booming, "What the hell is going on here?" Zayan and his accomplices, turned in unison, their expressions ranging from surprise to panic. The manager, who had been monitoring the heist from another room, froze as he heard Fahad's voice echo through the building. "Fahad," Zayan began, his voice smooth, despite the tension. "This isn't what it looks like." But Fahad wasn't listening. His gaze shifted to the bags of money and then back to Zayan. "You used me," he said, his voice trembling with anger. "You used my wife." Zayan tried to defuse the situation, but Fahad's fury was uncontainable. He lunged at Zayan, a scuffle breaking out amidst the stacks of money. The other accomplices hesitated, unsure whether to intervene or flee. The commotion attracted the manager, who rushed in, his own fear evident. In the chaos, Zayan managed to break free. "You're making a mistake, Fahad," he said, his voice laced with a mix of anger and desperation. But Fahad wasn't backing down. "The mistake was ever trusting you," he spat, his eyes blazing with betrayal. Amira, unable to shake her unease, decided to check on Fahad. She arrived at the bank, the sight of police cars parked outside, sending her heart into overdrive. She rushed inside, her breath hitching as she saw the aftermath of the confrontation. Zayan was being handcuffed, his once confident demeanor replaced by a look of defeat. Fahad stood nearby, his expression a mix of anger and heartbreak. When his eyes met Amira's, a silence fell over the room. The weight of her betrayal was evident in his gaze, and Amira felt her world crumble around her. "Fahad," she began, but he held up a hand, stopping her. "Don't," he said, his voice cold and distant. "I trusted you. I trusted both of you." The manager, realizing the plan had failed, attempted to flee but was quickly apprehended by the police. The chaos of the night ended with Zayan and the manager being taken away, their dreams of wealth replaced by the reality of their actions. Amira and Fahad returned home in silence, the tension between them palpable. Fahad's trust had been shattered, and Amira knew she had no excuses. As they sat in the dimly lit living room, Fahad finally spoke. "Why, Amira? Was our life not enough for you?" Tears streamed down Amira's face as she struggled to find the words. "I don't know," she whispered. "I was lost, Fahad. I made a mistake." But Fahad couldn't bring himself to forgive her. The betrayal had cut too deep, leaving a wound that would take more than time to heal. As the night stretched on, they sat in silence, two people who had once shared everything now separated by a chasm of betrayal. In the days that followed, Fahad focused on rebuilding his life. The bank's reputation had taken a hit, but his determination remained unshaken. Amira, on the other hand, struggled to come to terms with the consequences of her actions. She had lost more than she ever thought possible, her choices leaving a trail of devastation in their wake. Zayan, now facing a lengthy prison sentence, reflected on his decisions. For the first time, he felt the weight of his actions, the lives he had ruined in his pursuit of wealth. The charm and confidence that had once defined him were replaced by regret and remorse. As the dust settled, the scars of betrayal remained. Fahad and Amira's marriage, once a source of strength, now stood as a reminder of the fragility of trust. And while Zayan and the manager paid the price for their actions, the echoes of that fateful night would linger, a testament to the consequences of greed and betrayal. The days following the robbery were marked by silence, anger, and regret. The once warm and lively home of Fahad and Amira became a cold, uninviting space, mirroring the chasm that now separated them. Fahad immersed himself in work, not as a means of rebuilding the bank's reputation, but to escape the reality of his broken marriage. Amira, burdened by guilt, withdrew into herself, finding solace only in the solitude of their empty house. Fahad's sleepless nights were consumed by thoughts of betrayal. He replayed the events over and over in his mind, unable to fathom how the woman he had trusted with his life could become part of a conspiracy that nearly destroyed him. The love he had cherished so deeply now felt like a cruel illusion. At this bank, the fallout from the robbery was severe. Customers' trust had been shaken, and rumors spread like wildfire. Fahad worked tirelessly, meeting with stakeholders and issuing reassurances. The police investigation was still underway, and every step forward felt like trudging through quicksand. Amira tried to reach out to Fahad, her attempts met with cold indifference. One evening she mustered the courage to confront him. "Fahad, we need to talk," she said softly, her voice trembling. Fahad didn't look up from the stack of papers in front of him. "What is there to talk about, Amira?" "You made your choice." Tears welled in her eyes. "I know I've hurt you. I know I've ruined everything, but I need you to understand why." Finally, he looked at her, his eyes cold and unforgiving. "Why, Amira? Because you were bored? Because you wanted excitement? Or was it because he made you feel something I couldn't?" She shook her head vehemently. "No, it wasn't like that. I was lost, Fahad. I thought I could keep everything together, but I was wrong. I thought I could control it." Fahad's voice rose, the pain in his words unmistakable. "Control it? You let a stranger into our lives, into our home, and into your heart. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Amira broke down, her sobs filling the room. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." But Fahad couldn't bring himself to comfort her. Instead, he left the room, leaving her alone with her guilt and despair. Meanwhile, in the confines of his cell, Zayan's charm and confidence had given way to introspection. The prison walls were a stark reminder of his choices, and, for the first time, he began to understand the depth of his actions. He thought of Amira often, wondering if she hated him or if she still thought about him at all. The police investigation into the robbery uncovered the full extent of Zayan's manipulations. The evidence against him and the bank manager was overwhelming, leaving no room for leniency. The manager, seething with anger over being double-crossed, testified against Zayan in an attempt to reduce his sentence. Their alliance had crumbled, replaced by mutual animosity. One day, Zayan received an unexpected visitor. Amira stood on the other side of the glass partition, her face pale and drawn. He picked up the phone hesitantly, unsure of what to say. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Zayan sighed, his expression one of regret. "I thought I could have it all. The money, you, a better life. But I was wrong." Amira's eyes filled with tears. "You used me. You destroyed my life." "My marriage, was it worth it?" "No," he admitted. "It wasn't. I'm sorry, Amira." "For everything." She nodded, her face hardening. "Sorry won't fix this. Sorry won't undo what's been done." As she left, Zayan realized that he had lost the one person who had seen more in him than just his charm. The weight of his actions bore down on him, leaving him with nothing but regret. Back at home, Fahad received a letter from the police detailing the final report on the robbery. Reading it, he discovered details about the manager's involvement, Zayan's full plan, and even Amira's role. Though she hadn't actively participated in the robbery, her silence had been complicit. That night, Fahad confronted Amira once again. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded, throwing the report on the table. "You knew what was happening, and you said nothing." Amira's face crumpled. "I didn't know how. I thought I could stop it. I didn't want to lose you." "You lost me the moment you let him into your life," Fahad said coldly. "Do you even understand the damage you've done?" She nodded, her voice breaking. "I do, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it right." Fahad's anger subsided slightly, replaced by a deep sadness. "I don't know if we can come back from this, Amira. I don't know if I can ever trust you again." The weight of his words hung in the air, leaving Amira to wonder if their marriage could survive the storm they had created. Zayan's trial began a month later. Fahad attended, not out of a desire for closure, but to see justice served. As the proceedings unfolded, the full extent of Zayan's deceit was laid bare. Witnesses testified about his manipulations, painting a picture of a man driven by greed and ambition. When it was Amira's turn to testify, she faced Zayan for the first time in weeks. Her voice was steady as she recounted her interactions with him, her pain evident but controlled. Zayan listened in silence, his gaze fixed on her, but she avoided his eyes. The trial ended with a guilty verdict for both Zayan and the manager. As Zayan was led away, he glanced at Amira one last time, a flicker of remorse crossing his face. But Amira didn't look back. As the weeks turned into months, Fahad and Amira tried to rebuild their lives. Fahad threw himself into his work, determined to restore the bank's reputation. Amira sought therapy, hoping to understand her actions and find a way to heal. Their marriage remained strained, but they continued to live under the same roof, their interactions cautious and distant. One evening, Fahad came home to find Amira sitting at the dining table, a stack of papers in front of her. "What's this?" he asked. She pushed the papers toward him. "Divorce papers. I've signed them. If you want to move on, I won't stop you." Fahad stared at the papers, his emotions a tumultuous mix of anger, sadness, and confusion. After a long silence, he said, "I don't know if I can forgive you, Amira, but I don't know if I'm ready to let go either." Amira looked at him, hope flickering in her eyes. "Then don't. Let's try, Fahad. Let's try to find a way back to each other." Though the road ahead was uncertain, both knew that rebuilding trust would be their greatest challenge. Yet, amidst the ruins of their relationship, a glimmer of hope remained, a chance to rebuild, to heal, and perhaps to forgive. In the weeks following the robbery, the fallout was severe. Fahad worked tirelessly to stabilize his bank's reputation, but the betrayal he endured haunted him at every turn. The press had caught wind of the scandal, painting it as a tale of greed and broken trust. Reporters camped outside his house, their flashes illuminating the cracks in his marriage. Inside, the atmosphere between Fahad and Amira had grown colder than ever. Fahad spent long hours at the bank, pouring his energy into damage control. Despite his efforts, whispers among employees and clients persisted. The community's trust in him, once unshakable, now teetered on the brink. Each meeting, each phone call carried the weight of judgment, and Fahad felt the strain growing heavier with each passing day. Amira, on the other hand, was a shell of her former self. She spent her days in solitude, replaying the events in her mind. She tried reaching out to Fahad, but her attempts at reconciliation were met with silence or curt responses. The distance between them was a chasm she couldn't bridge, no matter how hard she tried. One evening, as Fahad returned home late, he found Amira waiting for him in the living room. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. She stood as he entered, clutching a letter in her hand. "Fahad," she began, her voice trembling. "I know I've hurt you more than words can ever repair. I can't change what I've done, but I need you to know that I'm truly sorry." Fahad's expression was unreadable as he took a seat, his briefcase still in hand. "Sorry doesn't undo the damage, Amira," he said after a long pause. "You broke my trust, and I don't know if that can ever be fixed." Amira's tears fell freely as she handed him the letter. "I wrote this for you. It's everything I've been feeling. Everything I wish I could say. Please, just read it." Fahad took the letter reluctantly, setting it aside. "I'll read it when I'm ready," he said, his tone devoid of emotion. Amira nodded and retreated to their bedroom, her heart heavy with the weight of her actions. Meanwhile, Zayan's life behind bars was a harsh wake-up call. The charm that had once opened doors for him meant nothing in the unforgiving environment of prison. He faced daily threats and violence, his every move scrutinized by those who sought to exploit his weakness. Despite his surroundings, Zayan's mind often wandered to Amira. He regretted involving her in his schemes, but his remorse couldn't erase the consequences of his choices. He spent his days in quiet reflection, wondering if he'd ever find redemption for the damage he had caused. The manager, too, faced his own reckoning. Ostracized by his peers and disowned by his family, he grappled with the shame of his actions. His role in the robbery had been exposed, and the community's disdain was unrelenting. For him, the isolation was almost worse than the legal consequences. Stripped of his position and respect, he spent his days in solitude, haunted by the choices that led to his downfall. One fateful day, a letter arrived at Fahad's office. The sender was anonymous, but the contents shook him to his core. Enclosed was evidence of the manager's deeper involvement in the robbery, including bank records and correspondence with Zayan. The letter hinted at a larger conspiracy, one that extended beyond the robbery itself. Fahad immediately contacted the authorities, providing them with the new evidence. As the investigation reopened, fresh details came to light. It turned out that the manager had been embezzling funds long before the robbery, using his position to siphon money into offshore accounts. Zayan had stumbled upon this information and blackmailed the manager into assisting with the heist. The revelation added a new layer of betrayal to Fahad's pain. Not only had he been deceived by his wife and Zayan, but one of his most trusted employees had been stealing from him for years. The betrayal felt like a knife twisting deeper, reopening wounds he thought had begun to heal. Amira, unaware of the new developments, decided to visit Zayan in prison. She needed closure, a chance, to confront the man who had upended her life. When she arrived, the sight of him in a prison jumpsuit was jarring. The confident, charismatic man she had once been drawn to was now a shadow of himself. "Why, Zayan?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why did you drag me into this? Why did you lie to me?" Zayan looked at her, his eyes filled with regret. "I never meant for it to go this far, Amira," he said quietly. "I saw an opportunity and I took it, but I didn't realize how much it would cost." "You used me," Amira said, her voice rising. "You made me betray the one person who truly loved me. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Zayan nodded, his expression one of deep remorse. "I'm sorry, Amira. I know it means nothing now, but I am truly sorry." Amira left the prison with a mix of anger and sorrow. The visit hadn't given her the closure she sought, but it had solidified her resolve to make amends with Fahad, if he would allow it. The legal proceedings against the manager began, and Fahad attended every hearing. Watching the man who had betrayed him face justice brought a small measure of solace, but it did little to mend the scars left by the ordeal. Fahad's focus remained on rebuilding his life and protecting the bank from further damage. As Fahad threw himself into his work, Amira took small steps to regain his trust. She started volunteering at a local charity, using her time to help others in need. She hoped that by doing good, she could find some redemption for her actions. One evening, Fahad returned home to find Amira preparing dinner. The sight was reminiscent of happier times, but the tension between them was still palpable. As they sat down to eat, Amira broke the silence. "I know I've hurt you, Fahad," she said, her voice steady. "But I'm trying to change. I'm trying to be better." Fahad looked at her, his expression softening slightly. "Change takes time, Amira. Trust takes time. I'm not sure if things will ever be the same, but I appreciate that you're trying." Amira nodded, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. As the weeks turned into months, the wounds began to heal. Slowly, painfully. Fahad and Amira's relationship remained fragile, but there were moments of connection that hinted at the possibility of reconciliation. For Zion and the manager, their time behind bars served as a stark reminder of the consequences of their actions. The story of betrayal and redemption was far from over, but the first steps toward closure had been taken. The shadows of the past still loomed, but the promise of a brighter future lingered on the horizon. The days following Zayan's confession brought a whirlwind of events that none of the involved could have anticipated. Fahad, still grappling with the depth of Amira's betrayal, faced mounting pressure from the bank's board. The robbery had left the institution in a precarious position, and Fahad's credibility as its leader was questioned. Zayan's startling confession implicated not only himself, but also the now-detained bank manager. The authorities were left with a tangled web of motivations, alliances, and betrayals. Fahad was forced to relive the nightmare during interrogations, providing detailed accounts of his interactions with both the manager and Zayan. Each retelling felt like reopening a wound. Amira, meanwhile, struggled in isolation. Fahad's cold silence toward her was unbearable. She couldn't return to her family. The shame of her actions hung too heavily. She found solace in volunteering at a local shelter, trying to distract herself from the growing void in her life. The guilt gnawed at her, a constant reminder of the life she had destroyed. One evening, Fahad's lawyer arrived with a message. Zayan had requested a private meeting with him in prison. At first, Fahad was furious at the audacity, but curiosity and a lingering sense of closure compelled him to agree. A week later, he found himself sitting across from Zayan in the dimly lit visitation room. Zayan's once confident demeanor had eroded. His face was pale, his shoulders hunched. "Thank you for coming," he began, his voice subdued. Fahad's expression was unreadable. "Why did you want to see me?" Zayan's gaze dropped. "I needed to apologize," he said. "Not for the robbery, though that was unforgivable, but for Amira. I didn't plan for any of this to happen." Fahad's fists clenched under the table, but he remained silent, allowing Zayan to continue. "I didn't mean to ruin your life," Zayan said, his voice cracking. "When I met her, it was supposed to be harmless. But I fell for her. And then greed took over. I thought I could have everything. I was wrong." Fahad's voice was cold when he finally spoke. "You've taken more than you could ever repay. Your apology means nothing." Zayan nodded, tears brimming in his eyes. "I know, I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed you to hear this from me. I destroyed myself trying to take from you. and now I'll pay for it for the rest of my life." Fahad stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "You're right, you will." He turned and walked away, leaving Zayan to sit in silence, the weight of his guilt pressing heavily on his shoulders. Back at the bank, the fallout from the robbery continued to unfold. Fahad faced a crucial meeting with the board, where his position as CEO hung in the balance. Dressed in his sharpest suit, he entered the conference room with a mix of determination.
"Andred, Mr. Fahad," the chairman began, his tone formal.
"This institution has suffered a significant breach under your leadership. While we acknowledge the extenuating circumstances, trust must be restored if you wish to continue in your role." Fahad took a deep breath and addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, no one is more devastated by this betrayal than I am. I've spent years building this bank, ensuring its success. What happened was a calculated act of deception, and while I accept responsibility for my oversight, I will not allow it to define my legacy here." His speech was met with murmurs of approval, but the chairman's expression remained stern. "We'll review your position and inform you of our decision in due course." Meanwhile, Amira's efforts at the shelter began to pay off in unexpected ways. She found a sense of purpose in helping others, her compassion shining through despite her personal struggles. One of the shelter's directors, an older woman named Mrs. Khadija, took Amira under her wing. "You're running from something, my dear," Mrs. Khadija said one afternoon as they sorted through donations. Amira's hands stilled. "I've made mistakes," she admitted softly. "I hurt the person I love most." Mrs. Khadija's eyes were kind but piercing. "Regret is a heavy burden, but running won't lighten it. Only facing it head-on will." Her words struck a deep chord, and for the first time in weeks Amira considered the possibility of confronting Fahad, of seeking forgiveness even if it was unattainable. A week later, Amira found herself standing outside their once shared home. The familiar facade now felt foreign, a symbol of everything she had lost. She hesitated before knocking, her heart pounding. Fahad opened the door, his expression guarded. "What are you doing here?" "I needed to see you," Amira said, her voice trembling. "I've been trying to make sense of everything, and I realized that running away won't fix anything." Fahad stepped aside, allowing her to enter. The living room was just as she remembered, yet it felt emptier without the warmth they had once shared. They sat in silence for a moment before Amira spoke. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Fahad. I just need you to know how sorry I am. I let myself get caught up in something I didn't fully understand. I betrayed your trust, and for that, I'll never forgive myself." Fahad's gaze was fixed on the floor. "Do you even know what you've done to me?" he asked, his voice heavy with pain. "To us." Amira's tears flowed freely. "I know, and I'm willing to spend the rest of my life trying to make it right, even if it means letting you go." Fahad's anger simmered beneath the surface, but he couldn't deny the sincerity in her voice. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again," he admitted. "But I also don't know if I'm ready to let go completely." Their conversation stretched into the night, a tentative step toward understanding. Though the wounds were far from healed, the door to reconciliation had been cracked open, offering a glimmer of hope amidst the darkness. As time passed, the pieces of their shattered lives began to slowly realign. Fahad retained his position at the bank, using the ordeal as a catalyst for stricter security measures. Amira continued her work at the shelter, finding redemption in her efforts to help others. Zayan, serving his sentence, began to write letters of apology to those he had wronged, a small attempt to atone for his actions. The scars of betrayal remained, but so did the lessons it imparted. Trust, once broken, could never be fully restored, but the possibility of rebuilding, however fragile, was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Fahad stood at the edge of the abandoned warehouse, its crumbling walls a metaphor for the life he had once known. The air was thick with tension, and the dim light of the moon cast eerie shadows on the ground. This was the place where everything would either come to a resolution or fall into chaos once more. Inside, Amira waited, her heart pounding in her chest. She had agreed to meet Fahad here, desperate to explain herself, to find a shred of redemption in his eyes. She had spent the past weeks haunted by guilt, unable to sleep, unable to think clearly. The betrayal had not only destroyed her marriage, but also the very foundation of who she believed herself to be. Meanwhile, Zayan, now a shadow of his former self, watched from a distance. Released on bail thanks to a loophole in the case, he knew this was his last chance to salvage whatever was left of his life. He wasn't sure why he had come here, perhaps to seek forgiveness, perhaps to confront the man whose life he had shattered, or perhaps to face the consequences of his actions. As Fahad stepped into the warehouse, his eyes adjusted to the dim light. He spotted Amira sitting on a broken chair, her face pale and drawn. She looked up at him, her eyes pleading. "Fahad, please, I need to talk to you." Fahad's expression was cold, his voice devoid of emotion. "Talk? What's left to say?"
Amira, you've said it all with your actions. Tears streamed down Amira's face. I made a mistake, Fahad. I was blinded by my own insecurities, my own fears. I never wanted to hurt you. You didn't just hurt me, Fahad said, his voice rising. You destroyed everything we built together. You betrayed my trust, my love. How do you come back from that?
Before Amira could respond, Zayan emerged from the shadows, his presence immediately shifting the atmosphere. Fahad turned to face him, his fists clenching at his sides. "You have some nerve showing up here," he growled. Zayan raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "I'm not here to fight, Fahad. I came to apologize for everything." Fahad let out a bitter laugh. "Apologize? You think a simple apology can undo the damage you've done? You used my wife, my trust, my life. For what? Money?"
Power. Zayan's voice was laced with regret. At first, it was about the money, but somewhere along the way, I got lost. Enough. Fahad's voice echoed through the warehouse. You don't get to explain yourself. You don't
get to play the victim. You made your choices and now you have to live with them. The tension was palpable, the air thick with unresolved emotions. Amira stood, her voice trembling. "Fahad, please, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know that I never stopped loving you."
Not for a moment. Fahad's gaze softened for a brief moment before hardening again. Love? You call this love? Love doesn't destroy. Love doesn't betray. Whatever we had, Amira, it's gone. You killed it. As Fahad turned to leave, Zayan called out, "Wait!" He stepped closer, his expression earnest. "If you can't forgive me, at least let me help."
"Let me try to make things right." Fahad turned back, his eyes narrowing. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" Zayan hesitated, then said, "The manager who helped me with the robbery, he's planning something worse. He's not done with you, Fahad. He's bitter, and he's dangerous." Fahad's jaw tightened. Why should I believe you? Because I have nothing left to lose, Zayan replied. I've already lost everything. If I can't fix what I've done, then at least let me stop him from causing more harm. Amira looked between the two men, her heart heavy with the weight of her choices. Fahad, maybe he's telling the truth. Maybe this is his way of atoning. Fahad hesitated, the conflict evident in his expression. Finally, he nodded. Fine, but if this is another one of your schemes, Zayan, I won't hesitate to make you pay. Together, the three of them devised a plan to confront the manager and put an end to his vendetta. The next few days were a blur of preparations, each of them driven by a mix of fear and determination. Fahad, despite his anger, couldn't deny the sense of closure he hoped to achieve. Amira, desperate to redeem herself, threw herself into the plan, and Zayan, for the first time in his life, felt a sense of purpose that wasn't rooted in selfishness. The final confrontation took place at the bank, the very place where the betrayal had begun. The manager, caught off guard, was unprepared for their united front. As Fahad confronted him, the truth spilled out, the resentment, the jealousy, the twisted logic that had driven the manager to betrayal. In the end, the manager was arrested, his plans thwarted. Fahad, Amira, and Zayan stood outside the bank, the weight of their actions heavy on their shoulders. Fahad turned to Amira, his voice quiet. I don't know if we can ever fix this, but for now, I'm just glad it's over. Amira nodded, tears streaming down her face. I'll do whatever it takes, Fahad, even if it means letting you go. Fahad didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He knew their journey was far from over, but for the first time in months he felt a glimmer of hope, not for their relationship, but for the chance to rebuild his life on his own terms. As they parted ways, each of them carried the scars of their choices, a reminder of the fragility of trust and the price of betrayal. And while the future remained uncertain, one thing was clear: they would never be the same again. Months after the betrayal, Fahad rebuilds his life with a renewed focus on his career, turning the bank into a model of resilience. Though the wounds remain, he chooses to move forward, leaving the past behind. Amira, living in solitude, dedicates her time to volunteering, seeking redemption for her actions. Zayan, imprisoned, writes a memoir reflecting on his greed and manipulations, hoping to atone in some small way. The echoes of their choices serve as a somber reminder of the fragility of trust and the devastating consequences of betrayal. Each finds a different path forward, forever changed by the events.